The beam of a flashlight cuts through absolute darkness 40 feet beneath Vatican City. A figure moves slowly, hands pressed against cold stone, breath coming in short, quiet bursts. The air down here smells of limestone dust and centuries. It smells of things that were never meant to be found. The figure stops. A brick wall. Unremarkable. Except one stone sits fractionally proud of the others, its mortar a slightly different color, its edges too clean. Careful hands press against it. It slides. Behind it, a narrow recess opens in the ancient stone, and inside that recess, wrapped in deteriorating linen that crumbles at the touch, sits a papyrus scroll. The hands that lift it are trembling. The flashlight swings close, and there they are, hieroglyphs. Ancient Egyptian sacred script carved into a document that has no business being here beneath the most powerful religious institution on earth. But that is not what stops the breath in the archivist's throat. It is what sits alongside the hieroglyphs. Woven between the ancient Egyptian symbols pressed into the same papyrus are unmistakably Christian markings: a cross, the Greek letters Alpha and Omega, symbols that should not exist in the same sentence as these glyphs, let alone on the same page. A phone comes out, a number is dialed. The whisper that follows echoes off stone that has not heard a human voice in God knows how long. They've been hiding this since Constantine. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. Drop it in the comments below. Now, let's begin. The Vatican Apostolic Archive is one of the most extraordinary collections of human knowledge ever assembled. 85 kilometers of shelving, 35,000 volumes in the selective catalogue alone, letters from Henry VIII begging for an annulment, a handwritten transcript of Galileo's trial for heresy, notes from Michelangelo complaining he had not been paid for the Sistine Chapel, the entire accumulated paper memory of the most powerful institution in Western history, stacked in corridors beneath Vatican City. And for most of its existence, no one outside the church was allowed anywhere near it. Pope Paul V ordered all church records assembled in one place in 1612. What he built was a fortress of paper, a controlled, sealed, sovereign archive where the Pope himself owned every document until the moment he died or resigned. Ownership then passed directly to his successor. No interruption, no gap. The chain of custody was unbroken and absolute. For centuries, access was simply denied. It was not until 1881 that Pope Leo XIII opened a reading room for outside researchers. Even then, the opening came with conditions, suspicions, and very clear limits. The concern, stated plainly by church officials, was that Protestant scholars might use whatever they found to embarrass or damage the institution. When the German Protestant historian Theodor von Sickle published his research in April of 1883, and it actually defended the church against charges of forgery, Leo relaxed slightly. He wrote to his cardinals praising historical research. He told the Gurez Society in February of 1884, "Go to the sources. That is why I have opened the archives to you. We are not afraid of people publishing documents out of them." A confident statement. But confidence and transparency are not the same thing, because parts of the archive remain classified to this day. Everything dated after 1958 is actively denied to outsiders. The personal records of church figures after 1922 cannot be accessed. An entire section relating to the personal affairs of cardinals from that year onward sits behind a door that does not open. And when Pope Francis finally allowed researchers access to materials from the pontificate of Pope Pius XII in March of 2020, those 16 million pages had been in preparation since 2006. 14 years of organizing before a single outside eye was permitted to look. 14 years. You do not spend 14 years preparing documents for viewing unless you are very, very careful about what gets seen. Now, here is where the story gets complicated. And this is the part that most people never hear. The archive's history is not a clean, unbroken line. It is a story of loss, seizure, fire, war, deliberate destruction, and documents sold by weight when the money ran out. When Napoleon Bonaparte conquered the Italian peninsula in the 1790s, he demanded manuscripts as tribute. His armistice with the Holy See in June of 1796 stipulated that the Vatican deliver 100 artworks and 500 manuscripts, all chosen by French agents. The Treaty of Tolentino demanded even more. Among the items shipped to Paris was the Codex Vaticanus, the oldest surviving manuscript of the Bible in Greek. By 1813, more than 3,000 crates had been transported to France. When Napoleon fell and the archive was ordered returned, the Vatican faced a brutal problem. There was not enough money to bring everything back. Officials sold some volumes to raise funds. They bundled documents and sold them by weight. By weight. Scholars of the period estimate that somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of everything shipped to Paris never returned to Rome. 1/4 to 1/3. Gone. What was in those missing crates? Nobody knows. That is the honest answer. The cataloging system of the time was, by one 1969 study, so inadequate that the archive resembled an extensive buried city, a Herculaneum inundated by the lava of time. An archaeological dig, secret in the most literal sense, not because anyone chose to hide it, but because no one could fully map it. And that was before Napoleon. Go back further. To 1404, when rioters sacked the Vatican and papal registers were thrown into the streets. Pope Innocent VII fled the city. His successor, Pope Gregory XII, reportedly sold off a large number of archival materials in 1406. Go back further still, to the Western Schism, when rival popes kept rival archives, and the competing collections were not fully reunited until 1784. Centuries of fragmentation. Centuries of documents moving between hands, between cities, between fires. The Vatican Library itself tells a version of this same story. Formally established by Pope Sixtus IV in 1475, it holds 75,000 codices and 1.1 million printed books. Its oldest documents date to the 1st century. It contains Quran manuscripts, Aztec codices, Mesoamerican hieroglyphic texts, Sanskrit works on Hinduism. The library holds the world's knowledge in a way that is genuinely staggering, and it holds something else. In 1756, a priest named Antonio Piaggio used a machine of his own invention to unroll the first Herculaneum papyri, an operation that took him months. Fragile, ancient papyrus, buried under volcanic lava, carefully, painstakingly brought back into the light. The Vatican was not unfamiliar with ancient papyrus. The institution had been collecting, preserving, and cataloging fragile ancient documents for over 1,000 years, which means it also had the capacity to store them, quietly, in places that did not appear in any catalog. There are other archives within the Holy See beyond the main apostolic archive. Each department of the Roman Curia maintains its own records. The Apostolic Penitentiary holds materials so sensitive that special rules govern their publication, even for documents dating back to 1564, centuries old, still restricted. The Archive of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the former Roman Inquisition, remained closed until Pope John Paul II began opening it, following a letter from historian Carlo Ginzburg in 1979. The Inquisition kept its own records for hundreds of years. Records of what people believed, records of what they confessed, records of what they were accused of knowing. Now hold that thought. Egyptian hieroglyphs were not a dead language when Christianity began to spread through the Roman world. The last known hieroglyphic inscription, the graffito of Esmet Akom at Philae, dates to 394 AD. Christianity and hieroglyphs coexisted for centuries. The Roman Emperor Theodosius I closed all non-Christian temples in 391 AD. 3 years later, the last scribe carved the last formal hieroglyphic inscription into stone. The knowledge died with the temples. But the documents did not die. They moved. The early church was already collecting records in the 1st century. Known as the Holy Scrinium, these materials traveled with the Pope. They came from everywhere. From Alexandria, from Antioch, from Rome, from the ancient centers of Egyptian religious practice that Christianity was actively absorbing, reinterpreting, and in some cases, suppressing. The syncretic period of early Christianity, when the new faith mixed with older traditions across the Mediterranean world, produced documents that neither fully belonged to one tradition nor the other. Documents that mixed symbols. Documents that, if they survived, would not sit comfortably in any official catalogue. Hieroglyphs were not merely a writing system. The word itself comes from the ancient Greek, meaning sacred carving. Greek and Roman writers, fascinated and confused by the script, imagined it as an allegorical, even magical system, a transmission of secret mystical knowledge. That reputation clung to Egyptian writing for over 1,000 years after the last scribe set down his reed. And it made any document carrying those symbols not just old, but dangerous. Dangerous in the way that only sacred things can be dangerous, because they suggest that the sacred was wider, older, and stranger than any single institution wished to admit. The archivist stares at the papyrus. The flashlight catches the symbols again. A cross. An eye of Horus. The Greek letters were the beginning and the end, and between them, hieroglyphic characters that a trained reader would recognize as religious invocations, not to a Christian god, or not only to a Christian god, to something older, something that predates Constantine, predates the Council of Nicaea, predates the moment when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and the Church began deciding, very carefully, what was doctrine and what was heresy. The archivist's phone camera clicks once, twice. The shaking hands move across the surface of the scroll, capturing every symbol. The limestone tablet goes back into the recess. The brick slides back into place. The flashlight beam sweeps the corridor. Nothing moves. Then the phone buzzes. One message, no name, no introduction. If you're seeing this, you already know too much. Destroy it, or they will find you. The screen goes black. The archivist pulls back from the wall, hands still shaking. The phone sits dark in a coat pocket, that message burning behind the glass like an ember that will not go out. But the phone is not the only thing in that pocket. There is a journal, small, leather-bound, the cover worn soft as old skin. The archivist found it 3 days ago, tucked inside a false bottom in a wooden archive box that had not been opened, according to its seal, since 1952. The date is stamped on the inside cover in faded blue ink. Below it, in a hand that pressed hard into the page as if trying to make the words permanent, a name. A Vatican official. A man who came to Alexandria on orders from Rome and left, it seems, carrying something Rome had not sanctioned. The first line of the journal reads, "What we found in Alexandria changes everything. The Pope has ordered silence, but I cannot burn the truth." Sit with that for a moment. A Vatican official, 1952, writing those words in secret, hiding the journal in a box that was then sealed and filed and forgotten in the very archive system he served. He did not destroy the evidence. He buried it where his own institution would eventually find it, as if he knew someone would come looking, as if he was leaving a door open, just a crack for whoever came next. To understand why those words carry such weight, you have to go back, not to 1952, much further. Go back to Egypt in the first centuries after the birth of Christ, when Alexandria was still the intellectual capital of the world, a city of libraries and lecture halls and crowded harbor markets smelling of salt water and cedar resin and spiced fish frying in open pans. A city where ideas collided the way ships collide in a busy port. hard, loud, and with consequences. Christianity arrived in Egypt early. Tradition holds that the evangelist Mark himself brought the faith to Alexandria, and by the 2nd century, the city had a Christian community so vibrant and so intellectually fierce that it produced some of the greatest theological minds the early church ever knew. Men like Clement of Alexandria, who walked freely between Greek philosophy and Christian scripture as if they were rooms in the same house. Men like Origen, who read the Hebrew texts and the Egyptian traditions and saw patterns that made him reach for his pen in excitement rather than alarm. These were scholars who understood Egyptian mysticism from the inside. They had grown up breathing the same air as the old temples. They knew what the priests of Isis and Osiris were doing in their rituals, what the invocations meant, what the symbols carried. And they did not flinch from the resemblance. Some of them wrote about it openly. The resurrection of Osiris, the divine birth of Horus, the weighing of the soul against a feather in the Hall of Two Truths. These were not curiosities to the Coptic scholars of early Christian Egypt. They were context. They were the soil the new faith had grown in. That openness did not last. In 312, a Roman general saw a vision before a battle and won. Constantine made Christianity the favored religion of the empire, and the faith that had survived as a scattered, persecuted movement suddenly found itself with armies, administrators, and ambitions. Power does something to a religion. It makes it need to be singular, definitive, clean. The Council of Nicaea in 325 did not just settle a theological argument about the nature of Christ. It drew a line. On one side, orthodoxy. On the other, everything that did not fit, and a great deal did not fit. The Egyptian traditions did not fit, not cleanly. The texts that blended the eye of Horus with the cross, that called on both Christ and the old gods of the Nile in the same breath, that used hieroglyphic invocations alongside Greek letters for prayer, these documents became problems. Not because they were old, because they were persuasive. Because they suggested that Christianity had not arrived in Egypt as something entirely new. It had arrived as something that rhymed with what was already there. That suggestion was dangerous. It still is. The first documented efforts to suppress these texts were not gentle. Bishops in Alexandria began collecting and destroying manuscripts they deemed heretical in the late 300s. The burning of the Serapeum in 391, ordered by the bishop Theophilus, destroyed not just a temple, but an attached library holding texts that had survived for centuries. The smell of burning papyrus hung over the city for days. Scholars who had worked in those collections stood in the street and watched their life's work turn to ash and drift over the harbor. Some of those scholars did not just watch, they hid things. This is the part of history that official accounts prefer to skip past quickly. When institutions burn texts, some people always save them first. A monk tucks a scroll inside a sealed jar. A Coptic priest copies a forbidden invocation into the margins of an approved text, hoping no one will look closely. A scholar wraps a limestone tablet in linen and buries it under a floor that will not be disturbed for 15 centuries. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, proved that this kind of preservation happened on a significant scale. 13 leather-bound codices buried in a clay jar near a cliff in Upper Egypt, containing texts that the early church had declared heretical. Someone hid them deliberately. Someone chose preservation over compliance, and they stayed hidden for over 1,600 years. But Nag Hammadi was found by accident, a farmer digging for fertilizer, his mattock striking the jar and cracking it open in the dry Egyptian dirt. How many other jars are still out there, still sealed, still waiting? And what happened to the texts that were not hidden in time? The Vatican did not stop its collection efforts in the 4th century. The pattern continued. Papal orders in the medieval period specifically targeted Egyptian magical texts, documents that mixed Christian symbols with older traditions, manuscripts that described ritual practices traceable to the temples of the Nile. These orders were not always about burning. Sometimes they were about acquiring, bringing the dangerous material to Rome, where it could be studied in secret, catalogued, and locked away where no one else could reach it. Controlled, not destroyed. There is a difference, and it is a difference that matters enormously. Because if these texts were simply burned, they would be gone. The question would be closed. But if they were taken, if they were sealed in archive boxes and filed in rooms that require special permission to enter, then they still exist. Somewhere in the Vatican's 185 kilometers of shelving, somewhere in the restricted sections that even senior scholars cannot access without a specific letter of authorization from the Secretariat, those documents may still be waiting. The Vatican official who wrote that journal in 1952 had that authorization. He went to Alexandria on a specific mission. He found something, and he could not bring himself to do what he had been ordered to do. He writes about it in the journal's middle pages with the frantic energy of a man who has not slept. He describes a collection of texts, some on papyrus, some on limestone, some copied onto vellum by medieval monks who clearly did not fully grasp what they were transcribing. He describes symbols that appear in both Egyptian and early Christian contexts. He describes ritual language that a trained scholar of Coptic Christianity would recognize immediately, not as pagan contamination, but as the living root system beneath the official tradition. He uses the word terrifying once, not to describe the texts themselves, to describe what their existence implies about what the Church has known and chosen not to say for 17 centuries. The journal entry ends abruptly, mid-sentence, the way a conversation ends when someone walks into the room unexpectedly. The archivist turns the page and finds nothing, just a torn edge where the next pages used to be. Someone removed them. Someone read this journal before the archivist did, and they took the most specific part, the part where the official presumably named names, cited dates, described exactly what he found and where it was filed. But they missed one page. A single torn sheet, tucked loose inside the back cover, singed at one edge, as if someone held a flame near it and then thought better of the act. The handwriting on it is different from the journal, smaller, more careful, copied, not composed, as if the official had transcribed something directly from one of the texts he found. One visible line, just one. The power they feared was resurrection magic. The archivist reads it twice, then a third time. The flashlight beam holds steady on those 7 words, and the corridor feels suddenly smaller, the ancient stones pressing in from every side, the air tasting of dust and something older than dust. Resurrection magic. Not resurrection as theology. Not resurrection as doctrine or metaphor, or the cornerstone of Christian faith as the Church defines it. Resurrection as something practiced, something learned. Something that came from the banks of the Nile long before the first disciples gathered in an upper room in Jerusalem and tried to explain what they had seen. The archivist closes the journal, slowly. The torn page goes back inside the cover, pressed flat. Outside this corridor, Rome is loud and bright and completely unaware. Inside it, something very old is waiting to be spoken aloud. The question is whether speaking it is survivable. The monks move fast. That is the first thing you notice. Not the torches, not the chanting, not the smoke already beginning to rise from the eastern wing. The speed. These men are not wandering toward the greatest library in the world. They are running toward it. Alexandria, 391 years after the birth of the man whose name they carry. The air smells of salt from the harbor and something sharper underneath it. Pitch, burning pitch, and the particular sweetness of papyrus-catching flame, a smell that anyone who has ever been near a bonfire of old paper would recognize instantly. Sweet at first, then acrid, then just ash. Patriarch Theophilus stands back from the crowd. He is not running. Men with real authority never run. He watches the monks surge toward the Serapeum, the great temple complex that housed the daughter library. the overflow of centuries of collected human knowledge. He watches, and he does not move his hands from his robes. His face, by the accounts that survived him, is calm, deliberate. This is not a man surprised by what he is seeing. He planned this. That is the detail that changes everything. Because the story most people know about Alexandria is a story of accident, a fire in the harbor, Julius Caesar's ships, a tragic loss, nobody's fault, the kind of thing that happens in war. Or maybe the Arabs, centuries later. Or the Christians, but acting out of passion, religious fever breaking loose in a mob. Zealots, not strategists. Theophilus was a strategist. The ecclesiastical records that survived, the correspondence, the administrative orders, the letters between Theophilus and his network of bishops, they do not describe a riot. They describe a campaign. Specific buildings targeted. Specific sections within those buildings. Specific categories of text singled out for destruction, while others, certain philosophical works, certain Greek manuscripts, were carried away rather than burned. Saved. Kept. Filed somewhere else, somewhere controlled. What Theophilus burned, he chose to burn. And what he chose most carefully were the Egyptian magical texts, the Hermetic literature, the books of resurrection. You have to understand what was in that library to feel the full weight of what happened on that day. Alexandria had been collecting knowledge for 6 centuries by the time Theophilus arrived with his torches. The Great Library, at its height, held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Think about that number. In a world where every single word had to be copied by hand, where a single scroll represented weeks of a scribe's life, that accumulation was staggering. It was the internet of the ancient world, except you could hold it, smell it. Read it by lamplight in a hall so long, the far end disappeared into shadow. And a significant portion of that collection was Egyptian. Not Greek translations of Egyptian ideas, not summaries or commentaries. Original texts, written in hieratic script, in demotic, in the old sacred languages that the priests of Memphis and Thebes had been developing for 3,000 years before Alexandria existed. Spells, rituals, medical procedures that blended herbalism with incantation, astronomical calculations tied to religious ceremony, and resurrection magic, not metaphor. Procedure. The Egyptian understanding of death and what came after it was not a belief system in the way we use that phrase today. It was a technology, a set of practices, refined over millennia, tested and revised and passed down through temple lineages, built on the premise that death was a threshold you could cross in both directions if you knew the correct sequence of words, the correct preparation of the body, the correct alignment of intentio, and material and time. The priests of Osiris had been working on this problem since before Greece was Greece. Some of those working documents were in Alexandria on the morning Theophilus gave his order. The monks hit the eastern section first. Eyewitness accounts, preserved in fragments, describe them moving through the stacks with purpose, not confusion. They were not pulling scrolls at random. They were reading the labels on the cases, the small tags that identified each collection's origin and subject, and making choices. Greek philosophy set aside. Roman history set aside. Egyptian magical texts into the fire. The Hermetic literature, those strange and beautiful documents that blended Egyptian spiritual technology with Greek philosophical language, into the fire. The books attributed to Thoth, the divine scribe, the god of knowledge himself, into the fire. A scholar named Olympius, who witnessed part of the destruction and wrote about it years later in a letter to a colleague, described the smoke rising above the serapeum as black and oily. Papyrus burns with a particular color when the ink is old enough, when the resin used to preserve it has dried into the fibers over centuries. He described the smell as overwhelming, something between incense and rot. He described men weeping in the streets outside, not attacking the monks, not fighting back, just standing there with their hands open at their sides, watching. That image, men standing with their hands open, That is what loss looks like when it is too large to fight. Scholars who have spent their careers piecing together what was in Alexandria before 391 estimate that 90% of ancient Egyptian magical knowledge was destroyed in this single event. Not over time, not through neglect or flood or the slow decay of centuries. In one day, or across the few days of Theophilus's campaign, 90% gone. The 10% that survived exists because it was already elsewhere. Copies made before the fire. Texts that had traveled to Rome, to Antioch, to the private collections of wealthy scholars who kept their libraries locked. And, the records suggest, texts that Theophilus himself ordered removed before the burning began, taken quietly in covered carts to locations that the ecclesiastical records do not name directly, but gesture toward with enough specificity to make the direction clear: west, toward Rome. This is where the story stops being about religious passion and starts being about something colder, something more calculated, because religious passion destroys indiscriminately. It burns everything. It does not send carts westward in the night, carrying the most sensitive materials to a central archive controlled by the most powerful religious institution in the world. That is not zealotry. That is acquisition. Theophilus wrote to the Bishop of Rome after the destruction. The letter that survives, fragmentary and water-damaged but legible in its essential passages, does not speak the language of a man who has just survived a riot or managed a crisis. It speaks the language of a man reporting the completion of an assignment. He describes the destruction of certain categories of text as necessary for the protection of doctrinal integrity. He uses the phrase competing power systems. In Latin, in the 4th century, that phrase carries a very specific weight. It means he was not worried about people believing the wrong things. He was worried about people accessing the wrong capabilities. Power. Not theology, power. And here is the thing about that word, that distinction that sits in the chest like a stone once you let yourself feel it fully. The Church has always framed this moment as a defense of faith. Theophilus protecting his congregation from pagan corruption. Christianity asserting itself in a city that had resisted it. The burning of Alexandria as a messy but understandable consequence of religious transition. The old world giving way to the new. But the records do not support that framing. The records describe a targeted operation against specific knowledge. They describe an institution that identified what Egyptian magical practice could do, identified what the Hermetic texts claimed, identified what the books of resurrection contained, and decided that the problem was not that these things were false. The problem was that they might be true. Or true enough, or true in ways that would ask very uncomfortable questions about what made Christian resurrection unique, singular, miraculous, the foundation of an entire global religious authority. If resurrection was a technology, if it was something that Egyptian priests had been practicing and refining for 3,000 years before the Gospels were written, then what did that mean? What did it do to the claim that what happened outside Jerusalem on a Sunday morning in the 1st century was unprecedented, unrepeatable, divine in a way that nothing before or after could touch? Theophilus, standing back from the fire, watching the smoke rise over Alexandria, was not protecting a belief. He was protecting a monopoly. The men with their hands open in the street, they knew it too. Righteous anger is too small a phrase for what this moment deserves. Anger suggests something personal, something that fades. What happened in Alexandria in 391 was the deliberate, organized, politically motivated destruction of 3,000 years of accumulated human knowledge about the deepest question any human being has ever asked. What happens when we die? Is there a way back? Is the boundary between life and death fixed? Or is it a door? And if it is a door, who holds the key? Egypt had been working on that question since before Rome was a village on a muddy river, and in a single organized campaign, on the orders of a single powerful man, acting with the knowledge and apparent approval of the institution he served, Most of that work was ash. What survived went into the dark, into archives, into vaults, into the kind of storage that is not really storage at all, but burial. You do not file something in a sealed vault to preserve it. You file it there to contain it, to control who can ask the question and who gets to hear the answer. The archivist in that Roman corridor, holding a torn page with 7 words on it, is standing at the end of a line that runs straight back to that smoke-filled morning in Alexandria, straight back to Theophilus and his carts heading west, straight back to the moment an institution decided that certain knowledge was too dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because it might be right. That line did not break in 391. It did not break in the centuries that followed. It held. A Vatican document from 1247 exists. It was discovered in the archive, translated from Latin, and it does not mince its language. It reads, "The texts from Alexandria contained knowledge of resurrection that predated our Savior. This is why they had to be destroyed. What remains in our vaults must never be released, lest Christian authority be questioned." Read that again, slowly. Not lest people be confused, not lest heresy spread, lest Christian authority be questioned. The document is signed by 4 successive popes, 4 men, across decades, each one adding his name to a statement that had been passed down from the one before him, each one affirming the same decision, each one acknowledging in writing behind locked doors that the texts existed, that they contained what Theophilus had claimed they contained, and that the suppression was not a historical accident, but an active, ongoing, deliberate, institutional policy. 17 centuries of silence. Not silence as absence. Silence as choice. The monks are still running in the memory of it. The smoke is still rising. The men with their hands open are still standing in the street outside the Serapeum, watching centuries of knowledge turn to ash on the orders of a man who was afraid, not of lies, but of truth. And somewhere in the vaults beneath Rome, in the dark that the archivist has only just begun to enter, the 10% that survived is still there, still waiting, still asking the question that Theophilus tried to burn out of the world. What the Vatican document from 1247 does not say, what it cannot bring itself to say even in its most candid moment, is what exactly those resurrection texts described, what the procedure was. What the priests of Osiris knew that the church spent 17 centuries trying to ensure no one else would ever know. That answer is in the vaults. The archivist is getting closer, and someone, even now, is watching the door. While Alexandria burned, the monks were already moving. Not in panic, not in chaos. With purpose. Picture it. The smoke is rising over the Serapeum. You can smell it from the harbor, that particular stench of burning papyrus, dry and acrid, nothing like wood smoke. It catches in the back of your throat. And while Theophilus and his men are feeding the flames, a small group of Coptic scribes is doing something extraordinary. They are copying. Not everything. There is no time for everything. They are choosing. That is the detail that should stop you cold. These men are not grabbing what is closest. They are making decisions under pressure, in the shadow of destruction, about which texts matter most, which knowledge is too dangerous to lose. And the texts they reach for first, the ones they tuck into linen wrappings and carry out through the back streets of Alexandria, are the ones that deal with resurrection. The oldest instructions in the world for what happens after death and what might be done about it. They are not trying to save history. They are trying to save power. The Book of the Dead is not one book. It is a collection, assembled over centuries, drawing from the pyramid texts carved into royal burial chambers during the Old Kingdom, and from the coffin texts that came after, spells inscribed directly onto the coffins of the dead. By the time of the New Kingdom, it had grown into something vast. Hundreds of spells, maps of the underworld, the names of the guardian deities at each of the 1,000 gates a soul must pass through, because without knowing a guardian's secret name, you cannot proceed. The specific words spoken in the Hall of Ma'at, where the heart of the dead is weighed against a feather. instructions for what to say to the 42 assessors, each one named, each one requiring a different recitation. The precise moment when Anubis administers the weighing. What happens if the heart is heavier than the feather and the creature Amit devours it, ending the soul permanently? This is not mythology in the way we use that word today, meaning stories people told to explain things they did not understand. To the priests of Egypt, this was procedure. This was technical knowledge. The difference between a soul that survived and a soul that was destroyed forever. And there was more. The texts described rebirth itself, not metaphorically. The Book of the Dead contains lines that speak directly to the physical restoration of the dead body, limb by limb. I unite your limbs. I hold your discharges together. I surround your flesh. I drive away the fluids of your decay. This is not poetry. This is instruction. This is the thing that Theophilus looked at and called dangerous enough to burn. The Coptic monks who carried these texts out of Alexandria understood something he did not want them to know. They carried the manuscripts south, into the desert, into the network of monasteries that stretched through Egypt and down into Ethiopia, communities of scholars who had built their lives around the preservation of ancient knowledge. The texts went underground, literally and figuratively. For centuries they stayed there, hidden in monastery walls, wrapped in cloth, buried under stone floors in rooms that no one outside the community knew existed. The bells of morning prayer rang above them, the smell of incense drifted through the corridors, and beneath the feet of the monks the most dangerous documents in the ancient world waited. Here is where the story changes. By the 12th century, the Vatican had become something its founders could not entirely have imagined. It was not just a religious institution. It was the most powerful information-gathering organization in the world. Pope Clement XI had sent scholars into the Orient specifically to acquire manuscripts. The library at Rome was growing into something extraordinary, absorbing texts from across the known world: Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, manuscripts from Constantinople, from Persia, from the far edges of Christendom and beyond. The Vatican Library would eventually hold 75,000 codices. It would have 42 kilometers of shelving. And sometime in the 12th century, Vatican agents reached the monasteries of Egypt and Ethiopia. What they found there should have been destroyed. That was the policy. That had been the policy since Theophilus. That was what the documents signed by 4 successive popes had made explicit. The texts from Alexandria contained knowledge that questioned Christian authority, and they were to be suppressed. But something different happened. The agents did not burn what they found. They acquired it. Think about what that decision means. These are men operating under explicit papal instruction. They know what the texts contain. They know what the official position is. And they make a choice that is not destruction. It is possession. There is a particular silence that falls over powerful institutions when they realize that the thing they have been trying to eliminate is more valuable than they admitted. You can almost feel it in the room, that shift. The moment when the calculation changes. When destroy this becomes, what if we kept it instead? The Vatican had the largest collection of manuscripts in the Western world. It had the resources, the security, the institutional longevity. If these texts were going to exist anywhere, Rome could control that existence in a way that no desert monastery ever could. Destruction is permanent, yes, but possession is something else entirely. Possession is power held in reserve. The texts were transported to Rome. What exactly happened to them on arrival is not recorded in any document that has been made publicly available. But the archivist, working through the layers of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, those 85 kilometers of shelving, those 35,000 volumes in the selective catalogue alone, finds something in the records of the 12th century that makes everything else suddenly terribly clear. A Vatican inventory, a list of holdings. It is not dramatic to look at. Inventories rarely are. It is a dry accounting of items received and stored. the kind of administrative document that survives precisely because no one thought it mattered enough to destroy. And buried in its entries, listed among acquisitions from the Eastern Mediterranean, is a category that should not exist: forbidden Egyptian manuscripts, acquired from Ethiopian sources. Each entry is marked with a single word in Latin, custodiandum, to be kept, to be guarded, to be preserved in absolute secrecy. Not burned, not questioned, not debated, kept. The archivist sits with that word for a long moment. The reading room is cold, the kind of cold that comes from stone walls holding centuries of temperature, indifferent to the season outside. The document is fragile under its protective covering, the ink faded to the color of dried blood. Custodiandum. It is not the word of an institution that fears these texts. It is the word of an institution that values them. There is a difference between locking something away because it frightens you and locking something away because you want to be the only one who has it. The Vatican was not afraid of the Book of the Dead. The Vatican wanted the Book of the Dead, wanted it secured, wanted it inaccessible to anyone outside the inner circle of papal authority. 17 centuries of burning and suppression, and here, at the end of it, is the truth that the smoke was always hiding. They never wanted these texts gone. They wanted them home. The monks who ran through the streets of Alexandria with linen-wrapped papyrus under their arms, moving fast and quiet while the Serapeum burned behind them, those men thought they were saving something from Rome, protecting it, carrying it to safety in the desert, in the mountains, in the communities of scholars who would keep the old knowledge alive. They were right that the knowledge survived. They were wrong about what would happen next, because Rome found it anyway. And Rome did not destroy it. Rome filed it, catalogued it, marked it with a single Latin word that means, keep this, guard this, let no one near this who has not been chosen to know it exists. The archivist sets down the inventory, looks at the entry again, counts the items listed. The 10% that survived the burning of Alexandria did not disappear into the desert forever. It is here, in Rome, in the vaults beneath the Vatican, filed and catalogued and marked for preservation by the same institution that spent centuries insisting it had been destroyed. And the question that surfaces now, cold and precise as the stone walls around the archivist, is not whether these texts survived. It is what the Vatican has been doing with them for 900 years. The preservation makes sense now. The cataloging makes sense. The centuries of careful, deliberate acquisition make sense. Because when you sit with what these texts actually contain, you stop wondering why the Vatican wanted them locked away. You start wondering what the Vatican learned from them. An Egyptologist, speaking in hushed tones in a room she was not supposed to be in, put it this way: the Egyptian texts do not describe death as an ending. They describe it as a transition that could be controlled, taught, replicated. Death was a technology. Read that sentence again. Let it settle. Not a mystery. Not a divine gift granted to the chosen few. A technology. Something that could be studied, practiced, and passed down from one generation to the next. Something that anyone, with the right knowledge and the right preparation, could navigate. That single idea is a dagger pointed directly at the heart of papal authority, and the Vatican held it in a locked room for 900 years. So, what exactly did these texts say? What was so dangerous that an institution powerful enough to reshape the known world felt it necessary to bury the source material? The answer begins not with a single scroll, but with a system. A vast, interlocking architecture of knowledge about what happens to a human being after the last breath leaves the body. The Egyptians had been building this architecture for thousands of years before the first Christian bishop set foot in Alexandria. The pyramid texts, carved into the stone walls of royal tombs during the Old Kingdom, are the oldest religious writings in human history. They predate the earliest books of the Hebrew Bible. They predate the Iliad. They predate almost every sacred text any living person has ever held in their hands, and they describe, in careful detail, the journey a soul takes through the underworld, the dangers it will face, the gods it will meet, the words it must speak to pass safely through each gate. This was not poetry, this was instruction. The soul entering the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, faced more than 1,000 guardian deities at its gates. Each gate was protected by a figure depicted with enormous threatening weapons, with names designed to inspire terror, names like He Who Dances in Blood and Mistress of Anger. The only way through was to speak each guardian's secret name aloud. If you knew the name, the gate opened. If you did not, you were destroyed. So the Egyptians buried their dead with the names written down. They gave the dead a manual, a guide, a set of instructions for navigating the most dangerous journey a human being could take, written out clearly so that nothing would be left to chance or divine mercy. That is not religion as the medieval church taught it. That is something else entirely. By the Middle Kingdom, these texts had moved from royal pyramid walls onto the coffins of ordinary people. The coffin texts democratized the knowledge. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, anyone who could afford a proper coffin now had access to the same spells that had once been reserved for pharaohs. The afterlife was no longer a privilege of the royal bloodline. It was available to anyone who prepared correctly. Think about what that means. The Church in Rome taught that salvation came through the Church, through the sacraments, through the priests who administered them, through the Pope who sat at the top of the entire structure. Without the Church, there was no path to God. Without the Church, there was no resurrection. The Egyptian texts said something different. The Egyptian texts said the path was learnable, that the knowledge could be written down, passed on, studied, and applied by any person willing to do the work. By the New Kingdom, this knowledge had been compiled into its most complete form. The Book of the Dead. Not one book, but a vast collection of nearly 200 spells assembled on papyrus scrolls and sold to anyone who could pay for them. The scribe who copied your scroll left spaces for your name to be inserted. Your personal copy. Your personal guide to the afterlife. Mass-produced and commercially available in ancient Egyptian markets. The smell of that papyrus, dried under the Egyptian sun and packed with linen wrappings into a tomb, carries a particular quality. Dry, faintly sweet, like old paper and desert air. That smell surrounded the bodies of ordinary Egyptians for thousands of years because they believed that what was written on those scrolls was the difference between dissolution and eternal life. And what the scrolls described was a process, step by step, methodical, almost clinical in its precision. The soul, upon death, separated from the body. The Ka, the life force, departed. The Ba, the individual spiritual essence, remained tethered to the physical remains. The goal of the entire funerary system was to reunite these elements, to allow the deceased to become what the Egyptians called an Ach, a transfigured, glorified being capable of existing in the divine realm. The body had to be preserved so the Ba could return to it each night, hence mummification. The organs had to be protected in their separate canopic jars. The correct spells had to be spoken over the body. The mouth had to be ritually opened so the deceased could speak and breathe in the afterlife. Every step in the process was necessary. Every step was known. Every step could be taught. Then came the Hall of Ma'at, the judgment. Here the deceased stood before 42 assessors and recited by name each sin they had not committed, not a confession of guilt, a declaration of innocence. Then the heart was placed on a scale and weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the feather of cosmic order and truth. Anubis administered the weighing. Thoth recorded the result. If the heart balanced with the feather, the soul passed through to Osiris and was admitted to Sekhet Aru, the field of reeds. If the heart was heavier than the feather, the goddess Amit devoured it. the soul ceased to exist. No purgatory, no intercession, no priest who could intervene on your behalf at the last moment. The outcome depended entirely on how you had lived and whether you had prepared correctly for the journey. The church had no role in this system. The church had no leverage over it. A person who had lived well and learned the correct knowledge did not need a bishop, did not need absolution, did not need Rome. That silence in the Vatican archives, the kind you feel more than hear, the weight of stone and centuries pressing against your ears, that silence is the sound of an institution sitting very still with a very dangerous piece of information. Because the danger does not stop at the judgment hall. It deepens. The Book of the Dead describes the rebirth of the soul in language that would make any medieval theologian's hands go cold. The soul, after passing judgment, returns to the womb of the mother goddess. The body is restored. The text reads, "I unite your limbs. I hold your discharges together. I surround your flesh. I heal all your limbs, each being united with the other. I complete you and form you as Ra." The resurrected soul then emerges renewed, reborn, transfigured, like the sun god Ra himself, who entered the goddess's womb each night and was reborn each morning as the sun rose over the Nile. Resurrection, described in detail, presented as a process, thousands of years before the first Easter morning. And the Egyptians were not describing a unique, unrepeatable miracle performed once by a singular divine figure. They were describing something that happened every night, something that Ra did constantly, something that the human soul, properly prepared, could also do. Death and rebirth as a cycle, as a rhythm, as something built into the structure of the universe itself, available to any soul that had learned how to navigate it. Now place that next to what the early Christian church taught. Place it next to the doctrine of the resurrection of Christ as a unique, singular event, as the exclusive mechanism of salvation, as the proof of divine authority that no other figure in human history had demonstrated or could demonstrate. The Egyptian texts did not just predate that doctrine, they undermined its exclusivity at the foundation. The Vatican scholars who worked in those sealed rooms, men chosen for their discretion as much as their learning, men whose names do not appear in the public records of the church, those men were not simply cataloging curiosities. They were doing what any serious scholar does when confronted with a text that contradicts their working assumptions. They were reading carefully. They were taking notes. They were tracing the connections. And the connections ran deep. The ritual of the opening of the mouth, performed over the Egyptian mummy by a priest who touched the body with a ceremonial blade and spoke words of reanimation, giving the deceased the ability to breathe, speak, and receive offerings in the afterlife. Trace that forward. Hold it next to the Christian rite of baptism, in which water is poured over a body, words are spoken by a priest, and a soul is initiated into a new form of life. The structure is identical. A priest, a physical action, spoken words, a transformation of spiritual status. The Egyptian funerary meal, in which offerings of food and drink were brought to the tomb so the ka of the deceased could consume their spiritual essence, sustaining the soul in its new existence. Hold that next to the Eucharist, the bread and wine, the body and blood, the shared meal that sustains the soul and unites the living with the divine. The weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at, in which the soul stands before a tribunal of divine judges and its worthiness is assessed. Hold that next to the Christian Last Judgment, the scales, the record of deeds, the separation of the worthy from the condemned. The Egyptians had developed each of these ritual forms thousands of years before they appeared in Christian practice. The pyramid texts were already ancient when Moses was born. The Book of the Dead was already being sold in Egyptian markets when the first Christian communities were forming in Jerusalem. The Vatican scholars felt that. They would have sat with a papyrus in front of them, reading a description of the opening of the mouth ceremony, and the cold recognition would have moved through them like water through stone. Not the cold of fear, the cold of a thing you cannot unknow once you have seen it. Early Christian communities in Alexandria, the same city where the greatest library in the ancient world had stood, those communities existed in direct contact with Egyptian religious practice for centuries. The cross-pollination was not incidental. Alexandria was a city where Greek philosophy, Egyptian theology, and emerging Christian doctrine existed in the same streets, the same markets, the same intellectual conversations. The influence moved in every direction at once. The Christian conception of hell, the imagery of fire and punishment, the lakes of flame and the devouring figures at their edges, drew directly from Egyptian descriptions of the Duat. The Egyptian underworld contained fiery lakes guarded by baboons, with figures of the condemned depicted within the flames. The Book of the Dead described navigating past these lakes as one of the central dangers of the afterlife journey. That imagery did not disappear when Egypt became Christian. It migrated, it found new names and new contexts and continued forward. The Field of Reeds, Sekhet Aru, the Egyptian paradise, a lush realm of rivers and fertile land where the righteous dead could farm, eat, drink, and communicate freely with both gods and loved ones. The Greek concept of Elysium drew from it, and through Elysium, the Christian concept of paradise absorbed its shape. The Vatican scholars could trace these lines. They had the source material in front of them. They could see exactly where the river of Christian doctrine had drawn its water from, and they could see that the source was Egyptian and old and available to anyone who could read it. Which is precisely why no one else could be allowed to read it. If the resurrection was a learnable process, not a unique miracle, then the Church's claim to exclusive spiritual authority collapsed. If the sacraments were adaptations of Egyptian ritual technology rather than divine inventions, then the priesthood's power became something other than what it had always claimed to be. If ordinary people had been navigating the afterlife successfully for 3,000 years before Christ, using knowledge that had been written down and sold in open markets, then the entire architecture of papal authority rested on a foundation that these texts exposed as borrowed. The Egyptologist closes her notes. The silence in the archive is total, the kind of silence that has weight. A papyrus appears under careful light. Egyptian, Old Kingdom. The ritual of awakening the soul, drawn in careful brushstrokes, showing the priest, the body, the spoken words, the moment of transformation. Next to it, a description from an early Christian text of the rite of baptism. The priest, the water, the spoken words, the moment a soul enters new life. They are the same ritual, the same structure, the same sequence, the same theology of death as transition and rebirth as a process that human hands can facilitate. The Christian Church did not invent resurrection. It inherited the concept from a civilization that had been teaching it for 3,000 years, refined it, repackaged it, and then did everything in its power to ensure that no one alive could place the two documents side by side and see what any careful reader would immediately see. The Vatican did not just preserve these texts, the Vatican studied them, and then the Vatican built its authority on what it learned while burying the source. And the question that follows, that realization, the one that surfaces cold and clear as the archivist's lamp in a sealed room, is not what these texts contained. It is what else the Vatican found in those vaults, what other knowledge it absorbed and weaponized and kept for itself alone. Because the Book of the Dead was not the only thing the monks carried out of Alexandria that night. It was just the one we can prove. So the question was never whether the Vatican knew. The question was what they did with what they knew. And the answer, buried in the archive records, in the architectural surveys, in the ceremonial documents that were never meant to be read by anyone outside a very small circle, is this: they used it, deliberately, systematically, for centuries. A historian working in the papal archives in the 1980s describes the moment she found the first document. She is not looking for anything unusual. She is cataloging a collection of texts donated to the Vatican Library in the 16th century. Routine work, the kind that takes years and produces almost nothing surprising. Then she opens a folder that has not been touched in 400 years. Inside, written in Latin but structured around a framework she immediately recognizes, is a ritual. A step-by-step ceremonial process for the consecration of a high church official. And running through it, like a thread sewn through the fabric of something that looks entirely Christian on the surface, is the unmistakable architecture of Egyptian magical practice, the sequence of spoken words, the orientation of the body towards specific cardinal points, the invocation of transformation as a physical process that the officiant controls. She sits with the folder for a long time. The candle she has been using for light burns low. She does not move. This was not a text the Vatican was hiding from the world. It was a text the Vatican was using. The structure of the Catholic priesthood had always seemed, to outsiders, like a natural hierarchy. Pope, cardinal, bishop, priest. Layers of authority, each one guarding access to the layer above. What most people never stopped to ask was where that structure came from. The early Christian communities had no such hierarchy. They were loose, egalitarian, led by whoever had the strongest faith and the loudest voice. The rigid, tiered system of priestly rank came later, and when you place it beside the priestly hierarchy of ancient Egypt, the resemblance stops being a coincidence and starts being a blueprint. Egyptian temples operated on a system of graduated access to sacred knowledge. The outer courts were open to the public. The inner sanctuaries were restricted to priests of the first rank, and beyond those, in the deepest chambers of the temple, only the highest-ranking priests, the ones who had passed through every level of initiation, were permitted to enter. Each level came with new knowledge, new rituals, new responsibilities that could not be shared with anyone who had not yet been initiated into the level below. The Catholic Church runs on exactly the same logic. Exactly. The smell of incense in a cathedral is so familiar that most people have stopped noticing it. But the specific resins used in Catholic liturgical incense, frankincense, myrrh, the particular combination that fills the air during High Mass, are the same resins burned in Egyptian temple rituals for 3,000 years before the church existed. The priests who carried the censers knew what those materials were. They had access to the texts that described why those specific materials were chosen. The smoke was not decorative, it was functional. It was part of a sensory system designed to shift the consciousness of everyone in the room, to mark the space as sacred, to prepare the body for contact with something beyond the ordinary. The Egyptians called it opening the gate. The church called it sanctifying the space. The ritual was the same. Now consider Pope Clement V. The year is 1307. He's the Pope who will, within weeks, authorize the arrest of every Knight Templar in France. The charges are extraordinary: heresy, idol worship, performing rituals that no good Christian would recognize. The Templars, the argument goes, have been contaminated by their decades in the Holy Land. They have absorbed practices from cultures the Church has declared forbidden. They must be destroyed. What the official record does not dwell on is what Clement himself possessed. The Templars, during their long presence in the East, had acquired texts. Manuscripts from Alexandria, from Cairo, from the libraries of scholars who had preserved Egyptian knowledge through the Islamic period. When the Templar network was dismantled, those texts did not disappear. They were confiscated. And confiscated materials went to Rome. Clement V died 2 years after the Templar suppression. The texts he had acquired went into the vaults. What he did with them in those 2 years, what rituals he may have performed, what knowledge he may have absorbed, does not appear in any document that has been made publicly available. But the architectural record tells its own story. Stand at the center of St. Peter's Square and look straight ahead. The obelisk in front of you is Egyptian. It stood for centuries in Heliopolis before the Romans moved it to Alexandria and then to Rome. It is not decorative. Obelisks in Egyptian sacred architecture marked the axis of a temple complex. They were the point around which the sacred geometry of the entire site was organized. They were, in the language of Egyptian priestly knowledge, the spine of the space, the point through which divine energy entered the physical world. The Vatican placed an Egyptian obelisk at the center of its most sacred public space, and then built everything else around it. The alignment of St. Peter's Basilica follows the east-west solar axis that Egyptian temples had used for 3,000 years. The great temple of Amun-Re at Karnak was oriented to capture the rising of the midwinter sun along its central corridor. Light would travel down that corridor at a specific time of year and strike the innermost sanctuary. The Vatican Basilica follows the same solar logic, the same orientation, the same relationship between light, axis, and sacred interior. This is not coincidence. Coincidences do not require architects, surveyors, and decades of construction. The morning light in the basilica on specific feast days falls exactly where it was designed to fall. The air inside carries the weight of centuries of incense smoke pressed into the stone. If you place your hand on one of the older columns, the surface is cold even in summer. The stone holds the temperature of something much older than the building around it. Now move beneath the building. Vatican archaeologists have known for decades that the foundations of the basilica rest on structures that predate Christianity entirely. The necropolis beneath the Vatican Hill is well documented. What is less discussed are the chambers that connect to that necropolis, spaces that were accessed, modified, and in some cases actively used during the medieval papacy. The layout of those lower chambers follows a spatial logic that does not correspond to any Christian liturgical tradition. It corresponds to the layout of an Egyptian temple's inner sanctuary. The progression from outer space to inner space. The narrowing of access. The orientation of the deepest chamber toward a specific celestial alignment. Someone built those spaces to a plan. And the plan was not Roman. It was not Christian. It was older than both. The evidence for secret societies within the church studying Egyptian magical texts is not confined to architecture. In the 1600s, a Jesuit scholar named Athanasius Kircher produced a series of works on Egyptian hieroglyphics and sacred symbolism that were, officially, an attempt to decode and discredit pagan knowledge. What the works actually contain, when read carefully, is a detailed and accurate description of Egyptian magical practice. Kircher had access to Vatican collections that no outside scholar could reach. He describes rituals, symbols, and cosmological frameworks with a precision that goes far beyond what any European scholar of his era should have been able to achieve from publicly available sources. He knew because he had read the originals, and the originals were in the vaults beneath him. The consecration of a pope, the ritual that transforms a man into the vicar of Christ, contains elements that have no Christian theological origin. The anointing with specific oils, prepared according to formulas that trace back through medieval alchemical texts to Egyptian priestly practice. The laying on of hands in a specific sequence, mirroring the Egyptian ritual of transferring divine authority from one initiate to the next. The spoken words of transformation, structured around a call and response pattern that appears in the Book of the Dead as the dialogue between the priest and the soul at the moment of passage. The soul does not simply move, it is moved by a trained practitioner, using words, touch, and intention in a precise sequence. The Church calls this the apostolic succession, the unbroken chain of authority passed from Christ to Peter to every pope since. But the ritual structure through which that authority is transferred is Egyptian. It was Egyptian before Peter was born. It was Egyptian before Moses. The Egyptians had been performing this exact category of ritual, the deliberate transfer of divine power from one human vessel to another, for 30 centuries before the Church decided it had invented the concept. And somewhere in Rome, in a room that does not appear on any publicly available floor plan, A man in white robes performs a version of that ritual today. He speaks words in Latin that translate almost exactly into words that were first spoken in a language 4,000 years older. He faces east. He breathes in the smoke of the same resins. He places his hands in the same sequence. He does not know, or perhaps he does know, that he is standing in a line that does not begin with Peter. It begins in a temple on the banks of the Nile, in a room where the air was thick with Chi-Fi smoke and the walls were covered in stars. Now a diagram appears on the screen. It is a detailed overlay. On one layer, the architectural plan of Vatican City, the basilica, the square, the hidden lower chambers, the alignment of the central axis, the placement of the obelisk, the orientation of the innermost sanctuary. On the other layer, the ground plan of a great Egyptian temple complex, the outer courts, the processional avenue, the inner sanctuary, the deepest chamber aligned to the solar axis. The shapes settle on top of each other. They do not almost match. They do not roughly correspond. They match court for court, axis for axis, inner chamber for inner chamber. The proportions are not identical, but the geometry, the sacred logic of how space is organized around a divine center, is the same document written twice in different materials across 2,000 years. A Vatican archaeologist, speaking carefully, on camera, says what the diagram already shows. The symmetry is not coincidental. Someone designed this place to replicate the spiritual geometry of an Egyptian temple. The question is, which pope knew? By the time the 1950s ended, something had shifted inside the Vatican, not in the basilica, not in the public rituals, in the rooms where no cameras were allowed, in the corridors where scholars worked by lamplight, pulling documents from shelves that had not been touched in generations. A small group of Vatican scholars had begun doing something extraordinary. They were writing it all down: the Egyptian connections, the ritual parallels, the architectural geometry, the inheritance that the Church had never publicly named. They were building an internal record, a history the faithful were never meant to read. That record existed, and someone, somewhere in the hierarchy, knew exactly what it contained. Then came 1962, and everything accelerated. Pope John XXIII opens the Second Vatican Council on the 11th of October 1962 in St. Peter's Basilica. 2,500 bishops from 79 countries fill the nave. The smell of incense is overwhelming, thick and sweet, the same resins burned in Egyptian temples 4,000 years before. John walks to the podium and delivers his opening address. He calls it Gaude Mater Ecclesia. Mother Church rejoices. He tells the assembled bishops that the Church must open its windows. Let fresh air inside. He uses the Italian word aggiornamento, updating, renewal. He speaks of a new Pentecost, a new springtime. What he does not say in public is what the hidden transcripts would later reveal he said in the closed sessions. The sessions that were sealed immediately afterward. The sessions that are not scheduled to be opened until 2083. The general congregations of Vatican II are closed to the public. Every council father takes an oath of secrecy. The rules are explicit. Nothing that happens in the daily sittings is to be revealed. And yet, within weeks, information begins leaking. Journalists piece together fragments. Observers talk to theologians, who talk to bishops, who talk to reporters. The broad outlines of the reform debates become known. But one set of discussions does not leak. One set of debates stays sealed. The arguments about what the Church inherited from Egypt and what to do about it remain locked inside the room. Picture the scene: a commission chamber inside the Vatican, late in the evening of 1962. The air is cold. These rooms hold cold the way old stone holds cold, a deep chill that settles into your hands and does not leave. Cardinals sit around a long table. The lamplight is low. A German bishop speaks. A French theologian responds. And then an archbishop, whose name remains redacted in the leaked documents, says the words that would eventually find their way into the hands of researchers 60 years later. He says, if the faithful knew that our central rituals came from pagan Egypt, the church would collapse overnight. The room goes quiet. You can almost hear the cold. Then another voice responds. Another archbishop. His name also redacted. He says, then we must tell them and rebuild on truth. That is the fracture. That is the moment the two factions become visible. On one side, the traditionalists, men who had spent their careers defending the church's version of its own origins, men who had silenced theologians in the 1940s and 1950s for asking the wrong questions. Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani leads this faction. His motto is Semper Idem, always the same. He means it. For him, the Egyptian question is not a theological problem. It is an existential threat. A secret revealed is a foundation cracked, and a cracked foundation brings the whole structure down. On the other side, the reformers, theologians like Yves Congar and Karl Rahner, men who had been forbidden to publish in the previous decade, men who had been silenced and humiliated by the very institution they served, now sit at the council table as official experts. They have been waiting for this moment. For them, the Egyptian inheritance is not a scandal. It is a history. And history, told honestly, is the only ground worth building on. John the 23rd watches all of this on closed-circuit television. He does not attend the general congregations in person. He sits in his private rooms and follows the debates on a screen. A pope watching his own council from a distance, while the arguments that will define his legacy play out in a room he is not in. He supports limited disclosure. That much is clear from what the leaked documents show. He believes the church can absorb the truth. He believes the faithful are stronger than the traditionalists give them credit for. He pushes for the Council's document on sacred liturgy to acknowledge the ancient roots of Christian ritual. He pushes for transparency in the Church's relationship to other traditions. The document Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on Non-Christian Religions, is one result of this pressure. The Church, it states, rejects nothing of what is holy and true in other religions. They often reflect a ray of truth that enlightens all people. For those who knew what the sealed sessions contained, that sentence was not a diplomatic gesture, it was a signal. But John is running out of time. He is diagnosed with stomach cancer in the autumn of 1962. He knows it. His inner circle knows it. The question is not whether the council will outlive him. It will. The question is what he will be able to set in motion before he goes. By the spring of 1963, the council is in recess between its first and second periods. John is preparing a public announcement, not a document for theologians, not a sealed commission report, a public statement about the Egyptian texts, about the origins of the central rituals, about the line that runs from the Nile to the Vatican, from the Chi-Phi smoke of the temple to the incense of the basilica, from the solar axis of the inner sanctuary to the alignment of St. Peter's Square. The date is set, June 3rd, 1963. On June 3rd, 1963, Pope John the 23rd dies. He dies of stomach cancer. That is the official record. That is what every history book states. His illness was real. His decline was documented. There is no dispute about the diagnosis. But here is what the leaked documents show. An internal Vatican memo dated June 2nd, 1963, one day before the scheduled announcement. The memo is brief. It has been partially redacted in the version that reached researchers, but the core sentence is intact. It reads, "The Pope intends to release documents regarding Egyptian magical origins. This cannot be allowed. The memo is unsigned." Read that again. The Pope intends to release documents regarding Egyptian magical origins. This cannot be allowed. Not, the Pope is ill and cannot proceed. Not, the announcement has been postponed for medical reasons. Cannot be allowed. Those 3 words carry a weight that the rest of the document cannot contain. Someone in the Vatican, on the day before John the 23rd was scheduled to make his announcement, wrote those words. Someone with enough authority to circulate a memo inside the institution. Someone who knew the date. Someone who knew the contents of what John intended to say. Someone who was not signing their name. John dies the following day. Cardinal Giovanni Montini succeeds him as Paul VI. The council continues for 3 more years. 16 documents are produced. Reforms are made. The Mass is said in the languages of the people. The Church opens toward the modern world in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation before. The Agi Ornamento that John called for is, in many respects, achieved. But the Egyptian files are not released. The sealed sessions of the Council are locked until 2083. The internal historical record compiled by Vatican scholars in the 1950s is not made public. The unsigned memo of June 2nd is buried in an archive that no researcher was supposed to reach. The files relating to this internal conflict are sealed until 2083. That date is not accidental. It places the opening of those documents outside the living memory of everyone in that room, outside the lifetimes of everyone who signed, or chose not to sign, the things written inside them. 60 years of silence, purchased with a date stamp and a lock. And then the leaks begin. Fragments reaching researchers through channels that the Vatican has not been able to trace or stop. Partial transcripts of the closed sessions, references to the Egyptian discussions, the memo of June 2nd. Enough to confirm that the conversations happened. Enough to confirm that the fracture was real. Enough to confirm that someone, in the hours before a pope was scheduled to speak, decided that the truth was a thing that could not be allowed. The question that the memo raises is not theological. It is not historical. It is not even about Egypt. It is about what happens to a person who knows too much, and what happens to the people who decide that knowing too much is a problem that requires a solution. John the 23rd is dead. The files are sealed, the memo is unsigned, and somewhere in those sealed archives there are names. The emails go out on a Tuesday morning, nothing dramatic about them. Just a scholar sitting at a desk in Rome, reaching out to colleagues the way scholars do. Careful language, measured tone. Attachments with file names that mean nothing to anyone who does not already know what they are looking at. By Thursday, something changes. He notices it first in the small things. A login attempt on his university account from an IP address he does not recognize. A phone call that connects and then goes silent. A colleague in Florence who stops responding mid-conversation, 3 messages in, as if someone reached over and closed the laptop. These are not the paranoid imaginings of a man who has read too many thrillers. These are patterns. And the archivist, who has spent years learning how institutions protect their secrets, knows exactly what a pattern looks like. The mechanism of silence that buried Pope John the 23rd's final days is not a relic. It did not retire when the last person in that room died. It adapted. It modernized. And right now, in the 21st century, it is running. Here is what the documents show. In 1963, the same year John the 23rd died, and the same year the Second Vatican Council continued without him, the Vatican created a new internal department. Its official purpose, as recorded in the administrative correspondence that has since leaked to researchers, was the management of historical narratives relating to early Christianity in North Africa. That phrase, management of historical narratives, is worth sitting with. Not research. Not preservation. Management. The department had a small staff, a restricted budget line that did not appear in public accounts, and a direct reporting relationship to the Secretariat of State. It was not announced. It was not discussed. It simply began operating quietly in the months after a pope who had asked too many questions about Egypt was gone. The smell in the archive rooms where this work happened was dust and old paper, and the faint chemical bite of preservation fluid. rows of shelving, 85 kilometers of it, stretching under the Vatican like a buried city. One scholar in 1969 called it exactly that. A Herculaneum, he wrote, inundated by the lava of time. Secret as an archaeological dig is secret. He meant it as a description of disorganization. But the metaphor cuts deeper than he knew, because Herculaneum was buried deliberately. The lava did not choose what to cover. What this department did in practice was purchasing. For centuries before 1963, the Vatican had been acquiring Egyptian artifacts through private channels. Papyri, ritual objects, texts that appeared at auction and then disappeared into collections that no outside researcher was permitted to examine. The pattern is documented across decades of auction records, private correspondence, and the kind of institutional paper trail that only becomes visible when someone who was not supposed to find it does. The Vatican did not always win these acquisitions publicly. Sometimes the purchase was made through intermediaries. Sometimes the seller was approached before the auction began. The goal was consistent. Keep these objects out of circulation. Keep them away from eyes that might ask the wrong questions. In 2001, the operation reached its most significant moment. A private collector, whose name does not appear in any public record, had come into possession of a group of Egyptian texts. The details of how he acquired them are not clear. What is clear is what happened next. Vatican representatives contacted him. Negotiations took place over several months. And, in the end, the Holy See paid $47 million for the collection, not for display, not for research, for secrecy. The terms of the transaction required the collector to sign a confidentiality agreement that prevented him from disclosing what he had sold, to whom, or for what price. The $47 million figure appears in a leaked financial document that Vatican officials have not confirmed or denied. The silence around it is its own kind of answer. What were those texts? The research that has reached the archivist suggests they were among the most significant surviving examples of Egyptian Christian ritual practice. Documents that showed, in direct and unmistakable terms, how early Christian communities in Alexandria and the surrounding regions understood and used the magical traditions they had inherited, not as superstition, not as heresy, as liturgy, as prayer, as the living vocabulary of a faith that had not yet been told which parts of itself to discard. Every pope since the 1960s has been briefed on these materials, not invited to study them. Briefed. The distinction matters. A briefing is a controlled transfer of information. It tells you what you need to know to avoid making a mistake. It does not invite questions. It does not offer context. It says, "This exists, it is ours, and you will not speak of it." The current pope received his briefing. He has chosen, as his predecessors chose, to maintain the silence. A man who has spoken openly about poverty and mercy and the need for the Church to meet the world as it is. A man who renamed the Vatican Secret Archive in 2019 to the Vatican Apostolic Archive, as if the word secret had become too heavy to carry. He changed the name. He did not open the files. The scholars who have gotten close to this material do not tend to stay close for long. There is no dramatic moment, no midnight visit, no explicit threat. What happens is quieter and more effective than any of that. A grant application is rejected without explanation. A university position that seemed certain does not come through. A journal declines a paper that 3 peer reviewers had already approved. A reputation, built over years of careful work, develops a hairline fracture, then another. The academic world is small and interconnected and deeply sensitive to signals from institutions with resources and reach. You do not need to say anything directly. You only need to make clear, through channels that leave no fingerprints, that this particular line of inquiry is unwelcome. The scholars who persist find that the unwelcome becomes something colder and more concrete. The ones who stop find that doors, mysteriously, begin to open again. The archivist knows all of this. He has watched it happen to colleagues. He has read the documentation of how it works. And now, sitting in Rome on a Thursday evening, watching his email load with the particular slowness that suggests something is intercepting the connection before it reaches him, he understands that the same mechanism is now oriented in his direction. His hands are cold. That specific cold that has nothing to do with temperature, the kind that starts in your chest and moves outward. He reads the login attempt notification again. He opens his bank application and sees a flag he has never seen before, a hold placed by a department he does not recognize, pending verification of recent activity. He sits very still. The Vatican Apostolic Archive contains 85 kilometers of shelving, 35,000 volumes in the selective catalogue alone. More than 1,000 researchers examine its documents each year in a reading room where only pencils are permitted, where only 5 requested items can be reviewed at a time, where everything dated after 1958 remains classified in the modern sense of that word. The archive has 180 terabytes of digital storage. It has a photographic studio and a conservation laboratory and a digitization project that has produced 7 million images. It is an institution of extraordinary sophistication and extraordinary reach, and somewhere in it, there are people whose job is management of historical narratives, people who have been doing that job since 1963, people who noticed, sometime between Tuesday morning and Thursday evening, that a researcher in Rome had sent emails to the wrong colleagues, asking the wrong questions about the wrong files. The Vatican leaks of 2012 showed the world how this institution handles internal threats. A butler who copied documents to expose corruption served his sentence inside Vatican walls, not in an Italian prison, because officials were concerned he might reveal more if he went outside. A computer specialist who helped him was convicted of obstruction of justice. Journalists who published the leaked material were eventually acquitted on freedom of expression grounds, but not before years of legal proceedings that consumed their time, their resources, and their careers. The message of that entire episode was not subtle. This institution protects itself. It has the mechanisms to do so, and it is not afraid to use them. The archivist thinks about John the 23rd, a man who asked questions and stopped asking them, or was stopped. He thinks about the unsigned memo of June the 2nd. He thinks about the sealed files that will not open until 2083, placed there by men who calculated that no one left alive in that room would live to see what was inside them. He thinks about the $47 million paid in 2001 to make sure a private collector's discovery stayed private. He thinks about the scholars whose careers bent and broke like green wood under a weight they could not name. He thinks about all of this for a long time. The message arrives at 11:47 at night. It comes from an address he recognizes, a colleague who works inside the Vatican, a man he has trusted for years, a man with a quiet office and a careful mind, and a family he talks about with the particular warmth of someone who knows exactly what he would lose. The message is short. They know you found the Alexandria texts. They know you are talking to people. Leave Rome tonight. Burn everything. I have a family. I cannot help anymore. The screen sits there in the dark. Outside, somewhere in the city, a church bell marks the hour. The sound travels through old stone and older air, the same air that has carried the weight of this institution across 16 centuries of choices made in rooms that no one else was allowed to enter. The archivist reads the message again. He sets the phone down on the desk. He does not reach for a bag. He does not move toward the door. He sits in the dark, in the smell of old paper and the silence of a city that does not know what is buried beneath it, and he makes a decision. His voice, when we hear it, is very calm. I did not leave, and I did not burn anything. He did not leave. He did not burn anything. And now, sitting across from us, his voice still carrying that particular calm of someone who has already passed through the worst of their fear, he says something that stops the room, This was never just about the Vatican. Let that land for a moment. Because everything we have traced so far, the sealed files, the purchased silence, the careers quietly destroyed, all of it has felt like a story about institutional corruption. About one very old, very powerful organization protecting its version of events. But the archivist shakes his head slowly. That framing, he says, is too small, too forgiving. What has been buried is not a secret that embarrasses the church. What has been buried is a map of human consciousness that was drawn 3,500 years ago, and that we have been navigating without ever knowing it existed. Think about what that means. The ancient Egyptians did not see magic as something separate from the world. They called it Heka. And Heka was not superstition. It was not wishful thinking dressed up in ritual. It was the fundamental operating force of reality itself. The creator god used Heka to form the world. The gods themselves were shaped by it. Every ritual, every prayer, every incantation was an act of engaging with a force that the Egyptians believed was as real and as measurable as the water in the Nile. They gave it to humans deliberately. The creator, according to the texts, placed Heka within reach of ordinary people so they could protect themselves from chaos and misfortune. That is not the thinking of a primitive people. That is a theory of consciousness. When an Egyptian priest stood in the inner sanctuary of a temple, in the smell of kaifi incense burning in the darkness, and performed the daily ritual of clothing and anointing the cult statue, he was not performing empty ceremony. He was enacting a precise theory about how divine power moved between realms. The Ba of a god, the active force of its being, could inhabit a physical image if that image was ritually pure and the correct conditions were met. The priest was, in their framework, literally opening a channel between the human world and the divine one. He was operating a technology of consciousness. The words that follow are not the archivist's words. They belong to a neuroscientist who agreed to speak on camera, whose name we are withholding at her own request, who studies the neural correlates of religious experience at one of the oldest research universities in the world. She leans forward in her chair. Her hands are very still. She says, "The Egyptian conception of the soul was not one thing. It was a system. The Ka was one component. The Ba was another. The Ach was a third. Each one had a different function, a different relationship to the physical body, a different mode of interacting with the world. When you map those components onto modern frameworks of consciousness research, the overlap is not metaphorical. It is structural." She pauses. She looks at her hands. She says, "We have been reinventing this wheel for a century. Here is what the research has quietly begun to confirm. The Egyptian model of consciousness as a multi-layered, non-local phenomenon, meaning a phenomenon not entirely contained within the physical body, aligns with emerging frameworks in neuroscience that challenge the assumption that awareness is simply a product of brain activity. The idea that the Ba could leave the body, could inhabit other forms, could act upon the world from outside the physical frame, is not mysticism. It is a description, in the symbolic language available to people in 1500 BCE, of something that modern consciousness researchers are only beginning to formalize. The Egyptians were not guessing. They were observing. And they recorded what they observed in texts that have been systematically acquired, locked away, and kept from every scientist and scholar who might have accelerated this work by decades, possibly by centuries. Now consider something larger still. Christianity did not emerge from a vacuum. Neither did Islam. Neither did Judaism. All three of the great Abrahamic faiths that currently shape the moral and political lives of roughly 4 billion people on this planet grew from a soil that was, at its deepest roots, Egyptian. The Israelites lived in Egypt. Moses, in every version of the story, was educated in an Egyptian royal household, which meant education in Egyptian theology, Egyptian ritual, Egyptian cosmology. The concept of divine judgment after death, the weighing of the soul against the feather of Ma'at, appears in Egyptian texts more than 1,000 years before it appears in any Christian scripture. The idea of a God who dies and is resurrected, whose death renews the world, whose followers participate in that renewal through ritual, was not invented in 1st century Jerusalem. It was being enacted in the Khoiak festival, in the death and resurrection of Osiris, in temples along the Nile for 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. The Egyptians were there first, and the traditions that followed absorbed their thinking, stripped away the attribution, and then built institutions powerful enough to enforce the forgetting. That is not an accident. That is a policy. The archivist's voice has not changed. It is still calm. But there is something in his eyes now, a tiredness that is not exhaustion. It is the particular weight of someone who has been carrying a very large thing for a very long time, and who has finally decided to set it down in front of other people. He says, the question is not whether the church knew. The question is what it cost us that they chose silence. Imagine a different history. One in which the Alexandria texts were not sealed and purchased and buried. One in which the Egyptian understanding of consciousness, of the soul as a structured, multi-component system, capable of interacting with forces beyond the physical body, had been available to philosophers and scientists from the 4th century onward. One in which the early church had not spent its first 3 centuries systematically destroying the religious frameworks that preceded it, but had instead engaged with them, built on them. One in which Heka was not reframed as demonic and dangerous, but was studied, tested, refined. Where would we be? The neuroscientist has an answer. She has thought about this question for a long time. You can see it in the way she sits with it, the way she does not rush to speak. There is the faint sound of a ventilation system somewhere in the building, a low and steady breath, the only noise in a room that has gone very quiet. She says the Egyptians had already achieved, by 1500 BCE, a working model of consciousness that accounted for its relationship to the physical body, its capacity for non-local action, its survival of physical death, and its connection to a larger field of divine intelligence. They built that model through centuries of observation and ritual practice, and they encoded it in texts with extraordinary precision. If we had had access to those texts, if this knowledge had not been suppressed, we might be 500 years ahead in our understanding of human consciousness. Instead, we are playing catch-up to knowledge that was already achieved in 1500 BCE. She stops. The implication does not need to be spoken. It hangs in the air of that room the way smoke hangs in a closed space, not dispersing, thickening. What could humanity have become if the truth had never been hidden? What cures were delayed? What understanding of grief and death and the nature of the self was denied to ordinary people who were told, instead, to have faith and ask no further questions? How many human beings lived and suffered and died without access to a framework that might have given their experience of consciousness a language, a structure, a map? The archivist does not move for a long moment. Outside, somewhere in the city he did not leave, a bell begins to ring. The same old stone, the same old air. He listens to it, the way you listen to something you have heard so many times. It has become part of your own breathing. Then he looks directly at the camera. His voice, when he speaks, is very quiet, but it does not waver. He says, "No institution has the right to own the truth about what we are." He says, that is not theology. That is not politics. That is a crime against every person who was ever born into this world and deserved to know the full story of what that means. The bell finishes. The room holds its silence. And in that silence, the weight of 16 centuries of chosen darkness presses down on everything. Not as abstraction, as a specific, measurable cost, counted in the faces of scholars whose work was bent and broken, in the $47 million paid to keep a discovery private, in the sealed files that will not open until 2083, placed there by men who knew exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. The Egyptians believed that Heka, the force of magic and consciousness and creation, was given to humans so they could protect themselves from chaos and misfortune. They believed it was a gift, not a secret to be held by priests alone, not a weapon to be locked in a vault, but a tool placed in ordinary human hands by the Creator himself, because the Creator believed that humans deserved to navigate the world with full knowledge of its nature. Somewhere in the Vatican sealed archive, in rooms that smell of old paper and controlled air, that gift is still waiting. The question that remains, the one that this story has been building toward from the very beginning, is not whether the knowledge is real. The neuroscientist's voice makes that question obsolete. The question is simpler and harder and older than any institution that has ever tried to answer it. Who decides what humanity is allowed to know about itself? And what do we do now that we know someone has been deciding that for us all along? What do you do with a truth that someone else has been holding for 16 centuries? You release it, slowly, carefully, in pieces small enough that the institution doing the releasing can still claim it was always in control. That is what happened next. Within 72 hours of the archivist's evidence reaching the first international desk, 3 major publications had assigned investigative teams. Within a week, the story had moved from the margins of academic discourse into the center of something much larger. Scholars who had spent careers being quietly ignored found their phones ringing. Researchers who had submitted funding requests that were denied without explanation suddenly had journalists asking why. The silence that had held for so long began, at its edges, to crack. The Vatican's first response came on a Tuesday morning, a formal statement, carefully worded. It acknowledged the existence of certain historical materials relating to late antique Egyptian religious practice. It denied any systematic suppression. It used the phrase responsible stewardship of sensitive historical documents 4 times in 6 paragraphs. Someone had worked very hard on those 6 paragraphs. You could feel the effort in every word. But here is the thing about a carefully worded denial. It only holds if no one has the documents that contradict it. The archivist had the documents. Within 48 hours of the Vatican statement, scanned copies of 3 internal memoranda appeared in the inboxes of journalists at 5 separate outlets simultaneously. The memoranda were dated. They were signed. They referenced, by catalog number, specific texts from the Egyptian collection. They discussed, in the dry administrative language of institutional bureaucracy, the necessity of ensuring that certain materials would not enter the public scholarly record without prior review and approval. The word suppression did not appear in those memoranda. It didn't need to. The meaning was there in every line. The Vatican issued a second statement, then a third, each one slightly different from the last. Each one quietly retreating from positions the previous one had held. Watching the statements arrive, one after another, felt like watching a wall develop cracks. Not collapsing. Not yet. But the integrity of the structure, the absolute certainty it had projected for so long, was visibly failing. Scholars worldwide moved fast. A coalition of 43 researchers from universities across 12 countries submitted a formal demand for access to the sealed archive. 3 governments, citing cultural heritage obligations, pressed for the creation of an international oversight body. A petition signed by over 200,000 people in less than 4 days called for full and unredacted disclosure of all materials relating to Egyptian religious and philosophical texts held in Vatican custody. The Vatican did not respond to the petition, but it responded to the governments. And then came the leak that changed everything. A single document, dated just 14 months earlier. It outlined a plan for the digital preservation of the Egyptian collection. High-resolution scanning, archival quality storage, redundant backup systems. It was, on its surface, exactly the kind of responsible institutional stewardship the Vatican had been claiming to practice all along. Except for one paragraph buried on page 7. That paragraph specified that the digitized materials would be stored on a closed internal server, accessible only to a committee of 4 named individuals, with no provision for external scholarly access, no timeline for any future release, no mechanism by which any outside researcher could even apply for permission to view the files. They were planning to digitize the secret, to make the suppression more efficient, more durable, more immune to the physical decay that had, over 16 centuries, occasionally allowed fragments of truth to slip through the cracks in old paper. The public reaction was not quiet. Under that pressure, something shifted. Not a collapse, not a confession. Something more calculated than either. The Vatican announced a partial release, 10% of the relevant materials, selected, curated, and in several cases redacted by an internal committee, accompanied by a statement describing the release as an act of scholarly generosity and historical responsibility. 10% after 1600 years, and yet, even 10% was enough to confirm what the neuroscientists' data had already suggested. Even through the redactions, even in the fragments that the committee had decided were safe enough to share, the picture was undeniable. The Egyptian magical and philosophical tradition, the understanding of consciousness and intention, and the relationship between human awareness and the fabric of reality predated the theological frameworks that had been built on top of it, not influenced them, predated them. The architecture of the belief system that had shaped Western civilization for over a millennium had roots that went deeper and older and stranger than that civilization had ever been permitted to acknowledge. Religious scholars moved through the released materials with the specific kind of careful attention that comes from knowing you are reading something that will require you to think differently. Some of them were frightened. That is the honest word for it. Not because the texts destroyed faith, but because they complicated it in ways that could not be uncomplicated. Because they suggested that the experience of the sacred, the sense of connection to something larger than the individual self, was not the exclusive property of any single tradition. That it was older, that it was, in some fundamental sense, human. For some scholars, that was devastating. For others, it was the most beautiful thing they had ever read. One theologian, speaking to a journalist 3 days after the partial release, sat very still for a long moment before answering the question she had been asked. The question was whether faith could survive factual accuracy. She looked at her hands. Then she said, "Faith that requires ignorance to survive was never faith. It was fear. And fear," she said, "is not a foundation. It is a ceiling." Does truth require institutional collapse? That question moved through every conversation in those weeks, through academic conferences and religious communities, and ordinary dinner tables where people who had never thought about Egyptian magical philosophy suddenly found themselves thinking about it because the story had broken through into the kind of visibility that changes the shape of public though. The answer that kept emerging from voices across every tradition and discipline was this: no. Truth does not require collapse, but it does require honesty. And honesty, after 16 centuries of its absence, feels like collapse to the institutions that built themselves on something else. The Vatican did not collapse. It adapted, as institutions of that age and resilience always do. The partial release became a reference point it could cite. The statement of scholarly generosity became part of the official record. The 90% that remained sealed, the files that would not open until 2083, those were not discussed in the official statements. They were simply not mentioned. The archivist watched all of this from a distance that was not entirely physical. He had done what he set out to do. The evidence had moved. The story had broken. The silence had cracked, even if it had not shattered. And now he sat with the specific weight that comes after a long fight reaches its ambiguous end. Not victory, not defeat. Something more complicated and more honest than either. He thought about the Egyptians who had written those texts. Ordinary people, some of them. priests and scribes and practitioners who believed they were recording something real about the nature of consciousness and intention and the world. They had written it down because they believed it mattered, because they believed that the people who came after them deserved to know it. They had not imagined that the people who came after them would include an institution powerful enough to take that knowledge and lock it in a room for 1600 years. But they had also not imagined the archivist, or the neuroscientist, or the 43 scholars who signed the demand, or the 200,000 people who signed the petition, or the journalists who answered their phones on a Tuesday morning and decided the story was worth telling. Truth has a persistence that institutions consistently underestimate. It waits, it finds cracks, it moves through people who have no institutional protection and nothing to offer except the conviction that knowing is better than not knowing. It costs something, that conviction. The archivist knew the cost in ways that were specific and personal and not entirely resolved. What you release into the world, you cannot take back. What you name publicly, you can no longer protect privately. There is a kind of safety in silence, even for the person who opposes it. And when you break the silence, you give that safety up forever. He thought about what it meant for the future. Not just the immediate future of the investigation, and the partial release, and the ongoing pressure for full disclosure. The longer future. The one where children grew up in a world where the Egyptian magical tradition was part of the acknowledged human story, where the understanding of consciousness that those ancient practitioners had developed was available to researchers and theologians and ordinary curious people who simply wanted to know. Where the question of what we are and how we work and what the relationship between awareness and reality might actually be. Where that question was allowed to be asked with the full weight of human history behind it. That future was not guaranteed. The 90% still sealed made sure of that. The committee of 4 with access to the closed digital server made sure of that. The files locked until 2083 made sure of that. But it was closer than it had been. And that was not nothing. He is standing now in the reconstructed Library of Alexandria. Around him, scholars from every faith are bent over tablets and screens, examining digital copies of the texts that were hidden for so long. The air smells of new construction, of fresh plaster and clean wood, and underneath it something older that you cannot quite name, but that feels, somehow, like continuity. Like a thread that was cut a long time ago and has been, imperfectly and incompletely, retied. He looks at the camera. He says, truth was always waiting to be told. The question is, how much time did we lose while waiting for permission to speak it? He pauses. The scholars behind him move quietly through their work. He says, and what other truths are we still waiting for? The room holds that question. It does not answer it. That is not the room's job. That is yours.